This morning with us we have Dr. Chris Gambill. He's our speaker today. He is the manager of Congregational Health Services for the Center for Congregational Health, a ministry connected with Wake Forest Baptist Hospital. I don't keep up very well with the actual name of that institution. Is that close enough? Okay. I should put medical school in there somewhere, but the center supports congregations and clergy with consultation and training. I received my own interim training through the center about 20 years ago. Chris received his training about the same time. Several years later, I received my consultant training through the center, and about the same time, Chris got his. So Chris has been on the center, part of the center for its entire 20-year life. In spite of the fact that I got all my training there, I really do commend the center to you for its expertise, if not the skill of its training in every instance. But Chris is a graduate of Wake Forest and Southeastern Baptist Seminary. He's an ordained Baptist minister. He has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. He was a campus minister at Appalachian State and then at NC State. Again, he's been at the center for about 20 years throughout its history. He is married to Joy, who is a librarian at Wake Forest and has two children, an 18-year-old son who just received his acceptance to Chapel Hill, and a 13-year-old daughter. And they are members at First Baptist Church. Before we ask Chris to come forward, I want to remind you that next week is the last time, the fourth of our presentations, and we'll conclude with David Guthrie, the PEC president, who will be our presenter and take some of this stuff and talk about the province and the Moravian Church. Today, Chris, we're delighted to have you here and invite you to come forward. Thank you. Let's all.
Well, good morning. It's good to be with you. I'm glad to be part of a Moravian Baptist sandwich these 4 weeks. We'll try not to be a bad influence on you. Actually, I should go ahead and try to make a connection with you that I have a connection with the Moravians. Despite being Baptist, that some of you might know the name of George Higgins. George is my cousin. Now that you're all relaxed and feel better about me, it's a small world, isn't it? Well, I do appreciate the chance to be with you, and Doug's kind words. As a Wake Forest graduate, there was a moment of trepidation, mixed emotion, when my son received an acceptance letter from Chapel Hill this week. But in the end, I looked at the cost of one and the cost of the other, and I'm feeling better all the time. Well, we have a topic today that is near and dear to my heart, and I know to yours, because I deeply care about church. According to my mother, I was a part of it now even before I was born, and not many days have I missed since. I've enjoyed being part of the center because it's allowed me to expand beyond my own Baptist roots, to have an intersection with lots of different denominations across the country and lots of churches. And it's offered me an interesting perspective and prodded my interest, both academically and otherwise, to learn more about what's going on. And so I want to present some information that is partly demographic and anthropological, but highly pertinent to us who call ourselves Christian here in the 21st century and beyond. I want to begin by framing this with a biblical narrative. I guess my Baptist roots do come out, don't they? And it's a story that, I wouldn't go so far as to call it familiar, because it is from the book of Numbers. I'm sure you all read it recently, but let me do a quick reminder. So the children of Israel have traveled for 40 years in the wilderness, and they finally arrive at the place that's been promised, that they're supposed to be at. And for different reasons, I suppose, they didn't just march right in. They did, I think, a wise thing, and they decided to send in 12 spies. Do you remember that story? So they send in 12 spies, and they're actually there for about 40 days. And they return, and it's time to get a report. And, of course, everybody's on pins and needles. I can imagine the anticipation. And they came back, and they said, you know, basically, we came to the land which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey, just like God promised. It's great. But there is one small problem. They said that the people who live there are strong. Towns are fortified and very large, and besides, and they went on to describe these descendants. And then later on they said, when we think of ourselves in comparison to those people, we're like grasshoppers. Grasshoppers. And in fact, they viewed us as grasshoppers. And basically said, woe is us. Well, the reaction was, as you might anticipate. Several of them went back and immediately began to pack up their possessions, and an underground movement began to go back to Egypt. Not that they could have found their way there, but they were ready to go back. And that's, I suppose, a natural reaction, that it had to have been such bad news that when you hear bad news, you retreat to what is familiar. Well, that's not the end of the story, because as it turns out, 10 of the spies were in agreement. This is a bad idea. We can't do this. The challenges that face us are, in effect, insurmountable. And the people went back and they wept. The next morning, the tide turned, because 2, not 10, but 2 stepped up with a different report. Caleb and Joshua. And they said to the people, I'll paraphrase it, we can do this. God brought us here, and with God's help, if we will trust, we can do this. And the rest is history. The dilemma before the people that day was, who will you believe? Will you follow the 10 and retreat in fear back to Egypt in a panic? Or will you take a chance? And will you trust and believe that even though it's daunting, there's a way forward? I'd like you to hold that frame of reference in your head as we talk this morning, because a lot of the information I'm going to present to you will feel like giants. And you're going to perhaps have a tendency to want to pack things up and go back to not Egypt, but to wherever John Huss was from. I'm not sure what country that would be today, but nevertheless, wherever that was. But I hope you'll resist that. The German philosopher Schopenhauer said that every truth passes through 3 stages. The first one, it's ridiculed, made fun of. And the second, it's opposed outright. And the third, it becomes, well, of course, it's always been that way. I'm not sure where you are as we listen to and see this morning, but probably one of these 3 stages will find you. The phrase is often used, at least in the corporate world, to talk about monumental moments and prompters of change, and we talk about a burning platform, which is, in a sense, trying to say that for most of us, we don't embrace change unless we're forced to. There has to be an issue out there, something that causes us. So if we were on the oil rig working away, it would take a lot to get us to jump off. Something has to be very, very compelling. And so at some level, I do want to present to you a burning platform, and I want you to think about, as a congregation, what it means to take a leap of faith, as you face the future that's ahead of you. I want to begin by talking about the state of the church, and by the state of the church, I mean church big C, Christian church in general, and I want to talk about the church in the United States. Every few months, I guess for lack of something better to write about, someone finds some poll that describes the state of the church in the U.S. Quite often, I'd say the vast majority of these actually are done by a process that perhaps you've even been a part of, called telephone polling. If you haven't, just wait a couple of months. I promise you'll have a chance. So the telephone pollster calls him up and he says, Doug, pick on my friend, we're doing a poll. Did you go to church last Sunday? Of course, Doug's response is, well, by all means. I mean, absolutely. I never miss a Sunday. I wouldn't think of it. Absolutely. Because, after all, the last thing you want to do is tell somebody, well, not really. That would make you look. So, by that methodology, we'll often hear that close to 50% of Americans go to church every Sunday. Doesn't seem quite right to me. I met an interesting man a few months ago. His name is David Olson. David is actually a church planter and pastor in a very small evangelical tradition whose name escapes me at the moment, but never mind. The interesting thing about David is that at the age of 16, he won the Math Award for the United States. I'm not sure what that involves, but I'm sure I wouldn't be qualified. And his hobby is church statistics. Tells you a lot about a man right there. But for several decades now, he has been gathering and collecting actual attendance figures from congregations all across the U.S. of different kinds into this huge database with tens of thousands. So when David speaks, you should listen. And so as he looks at actual numbers of church attendance across the United States, the actual number of people who go to church on a given Sunday in the United States is 17%. Actually, this is a year old, so take a little off of that. For those of you too far away, that's not 77. That's 17%. Now, that doesn't mean that only 17% of us ever go to church. It just means that on a given Sunday, only 17% of us find their way. That's a fairly startling number, I hope that you see it, as a percentage of the population. And it's going the direction that we don't like. Of that 17%, it breaks down kind of like this on a given weekend. Evangelicals take the lion's share, but they're about 9.3%. Mainline, which is your category, 2.6%, and Catholic 4.9%, for a total of about 17%. Included in his statistic, I should note, are not included are the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church. They are not in here. So, let's talk about traditional, what when we think Christian churches, most of the people that we would know of various stripes. Sorry. Thank you. I need a valet like that all the time. If you go back 20 years, you get an even more stark picture in some ways. So the dark is 1990 attendance, the green is 2000, and the red is 2009. So evangelicals have fared the best. Mainline is churches have gone from almost 4.6, Catholic from 7.2 to 4.9. And overall, back in 1990, over 20% of us on average went to church, just 20 years ago. And you can see the trend. You might be curious about North Carolina, and the truth is that we're pretty much in line, even though we are we in the buckle of the Bible Belt? I'm not sure, but we're in the belt somewhere. So, but we have also had a significant decline just in North Carolina of about almost 11%. This map of the United States shows the percentage of the growth or decline in percentage of population who are attending a Christian church between 2000 and 2009. The pink states are those that have grown as a percentage of attendance. See, you are paying attention. That's good. And the blue states have declined. Except for the orange one that I made here, we're blue too. 10.8. The most dramatic declines as a percentage of the population attending a church, perhaps not surprisingly, are up further north. Massachusetts, 21% decline. Connecticut, over 15%. Rhode Island, 21%. New Jersey, almost 15%. So forth. Two things you should note about this. Part of what you're seeing reflects a slight decrease in attendance of those who have already been going to church like you and me. But the bigger part of it is that the population of the United States is going which direction? Up. So even if we were to not lose a single attendee, the percentage of people going to church is dropping quite rapidly, to the extent that we will soon be a very, very small minority. Good news is that you're used to that. For others of us, it's a shock. We don't know what to do with that, because there was a day in my own childhood, a few years ago now, that Christians, particularly in the South, were a dominant culture and a dominant force in many ways. That day has ended. And I don't think it's coming back in our lifetimes. In the South, where you might have expected the decline to be avoided, we've also been in a steady decline for at least 20 years all across the South. Evangelicals, which is what we usually think of as the South in particular, have also declined 6% in the past 20 years and 4% in the last 10. So it graphs out like this. The worst hit, if you will, are mainline churches. 19.7% in 2000 and 2009. Even Catholic churches, with an influx, a large influx of presumably Catholic immigrants from Central and Latin America, they're not going there either. So even in the South, region as itself, there's been a significant drop in places that you wouldn't have expected. In general terms, in terms of the statistics, if you look at a congregation, and if you tell me that you're 40 years old, think you all passed that? Yeah. If you're 40 years old or more, then I will predict that you're declining at the rate of about 2% a year. That would be a good guess. Some are actually much faster. So the established churches, like the one here and the one I'm a part of, are the ones who really are suffering the most in this current context of what's happening in the larger church. I realize this is a small, but you only need to know one thing about this graph. The bottom represents the decade in which your congregation was founded. So, okay, you'll have to tell me. I don't want to guess. So what is it? Thank you, 1771. So we have to go all the way up here to pre-1800s. This describes the growth rate of congregations based on the year when they began. You're to the left of this. 1900s, 1930s, 1950s, 1970s. Finally, when we get to 1980s, we see the first growth. 5%. 1990s, 3.5%. And churches that were founded in the 2000s are the only really significant growth. So what this means is that unless you're a new church start, there is an extremely high probability that your church is not growing. This also is a way for you to help understand why there is so much talk about and resources being devoted to new church starts. Judicatory officials, and David's a friend of mine, so I'm not criticizing him or the PEC at all. I'm talking about in the sweep of things. They look at these numbers. And if you're struggling to make an impact on the larger culture and to not lose ground, where do you put your resources? Well, you probably put them here. Because putting them here, evidence says that you may not get the results that you're looking for. Of course, there are exceptions. There are established churches that are growing, but they are a minority. In many cases, a very small one. Now, I should also hasten to say that it's also not clear what the longevity of these churches are. Because there's a very high percentage of church starts that won't make it past 3 years. And even if they do, depending on how they're structured, it's unclear if they'll have a life that's anything like the life of your congregation. For example, just again this morning, as I was reading the paper, that the Catholic Church has bought the Crystal Cathedral. Did you know this? You see that? They actually took less money. They had a bigger bidder, but they wanted it to stay as in the Christian family. It really couldn't survive as an organization and as a church past its founder. I have a sneaking suspicion that will describe many of these churches as well, who are highly personality focused around a very charismatic pastor, kind of like Doug. So it is not clear at all when they exit. There's also an interesting study done, a self-study, which I admire them for doing it and admire them more for publishing the results of it, at Willow Creek. You're familiar with Willow Creek. It's in this category. Very, very large. They did a self-study, and they basically wanted to know what kind of impact are we having on people's lives. Are we being transformative? Which is, I think, what, as Christians, we're trying to be. Right? And what they found was that if you compared the choices and lifestyles and attitudes and whatever of people who went to church and those who didn't, there wasn't a significant difference. So I would suggest that at least at some level that means that church attendance doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're making the impact that we think or hope we want to have. So it isn't all about the numbers. But for just a moment, I do want you to think about institutionally what it does mean. And that we have tremendous investment, churches like mine and yours and others, in institutions and in structures. And I, for one, am not anxious to lose mine. I wanted something like perpetuity to go on. So the issue of numbers does matter, because in the end it translates to dollars, which pays the bills and allows us to keep the properties. And it is becoming a critical issue. A few weeks before Christmas, I received a call from a congregation that I'd actually visited probably 5 or 6 years before. And it was struggling downtown in a large metro area. It was in Atlanta, actually. It wasn't doing well then. They were down to probably 200 to 300 people on an average Sunday, which, by the way, makes them one larger than most churches in North America, in case you're curious about that. But compared to what they had, the size of their property was equivalent essentially to my church at First Baptist, which is basically they owned a city block. And when she called me just a few weeks before Christmas, she said, we think we might need some assistance with from yours. I said, fine, what's going on? She said, well, there are only 45 of us left. And the youngest one is 60. Well, I'm not sure if there is a way to help them, to be honest. But versions of that story, perhaps not as stark, are happening all across the country. And more so probably in rural areas, where the population shifts literally mean that in some cases there's 3 to 5 people left keeping the doors of the church open. And you can go 100 yards and find another one that's in the same instance. You've been to those country crossroads. You've seen them. So it's back to my story, a land of giants. And the reality is we're not making the impact on the larger culture which any of our founders had hoped for in this particular day and time. And sadly, the churches that are struggling most are really churches like mine and yours. They're somewhere in that vast middle. And this is the Gambill theory of why, so you know what that means. Ask my family, they'll tell you what that means. That we're in a bad place because in medium-sized churches, and I'll show you, the graph looks like this. The very smallest churches, 1 to 50, 1,000 and above, they're growing, we're shrinking. Why is that? Well, one of the dangers of being in this mid-range down here is that we're not large enough to where most congregation members would actually look around and say, wow, we're a large church. We should pay attention to people more. There's more of an attitude of, well, we're not that big. You know, people can find their way in. They can get connected. We all know each other. Look around, do you? Don't raise your hand. Small churches, 1 to 49, which I've occasionally visited, and some of my family up in the mountains were part of, there are no strangers there. You can't walk into a church the size of 49 and somebody not know that you've arrived, for better or for worse. And if you want that kind of intimate experience, which a lot of people actually do, and I think there is a deep hunger for relationship and intimacy, then that's a place where you can still get it. And they're often all related, so they produce their own descendants. So they're doing okay. The largest church are doing reasonably well too, for different reasons, not least of which is they have resources. You know? So when they want to have a Moravian Baptist sandwich or whatever their denomination is, you know, they don't fill it with piddling people like me, you know. They get somebody from the president's cabinet, you know, or they get, you know, who knows? They can invite people that actually get paid money for these things. And it's no big deal. And thousands will come out. And people go, wow, don't you want to go to that church? Look what they're doing. Big things done well. And they have resources to do it. Facilities, everything's shiny. Then there's the rest of us. And the sad thing is that we have a lot to offer, but we often are our own worst enemy. My experience at most churches is that, and you have to decide if it applies to you, but that our back door, to use a metaphor, is wider than our front door. So even for people who do come in and want to get connected with us, if you look at the attrition rate, it exceeds those numbers that are coming in. And in many places, if you were to interview those people and you ask them what happened, they'll say, well, you know, I just never made a lot of relationships. Never really got connected in, never really felt that welcome. I hear stories like that all the time. And it's not that anybody tried to be unwelcoming. That would be unthinkable. It was more in the category of benevolent neglect. We're glad you're here. Now I'm going back over to my family and friends. They'll find their own way. They'll be fine. There is a phenomenon that's happened in this country since 1958 that is very serious and having a huge impact, and that is a general loss of social capital. So if you want to know what was the peak year in this country for participation in a congregation, I can tell you, it's 1958. When was the peak year for participation in Kiwanis Club? 1958. What about PTA? 1958, which was a very good year, by the way, when I was born. Since 1958, there's been a steady, significant decline in social interaction in this country. Usually when I make these presentations, somebody will come up afterward, you'll finally do that, and say to me, the same thing has happened in my fill in the blank. Pick an organization, doesn't matter, if it's been around. Because we live under economic and social stresses that essentially preclude us from building relationships of any significance. And most of us now spend far more time with people we work with than people we share a life at church with. And that's a shift in culture. I grew up in Elkin, hub of the universe. Small town. 72 of us graduated from high school. Most of us wore diapers together. It would have been a little bit ridiculous, if not redundant, to talk about building community. I was tired of those people. I went to church with them. My parents worked with them at the mill, and the third week of July, the mill closed. And the entire town went to Myrtle Beach. It's remarkable. What else? Hey. It's like, same people. It's like, oh my God. Well, I find it remarkable. Our office is at the hospital. 12,000, my closest friend. I find it remarkable if I ever cross paths with anybody in the course of a week that I go to church with. If we do, we both kind of stand and look at each other stunned, like, what are you doing here? But that's the nature of our lives. Don't raise your hand. When's the last time somebody invited you to their house for dinner? When's the last time you had dinner with your own family? Don't raise your hand on that one either. My point is, our culture and our exterior lives are conspiring against us so that the place where you ought to finally be able to find deep community is often more like familiar strangers. So we're not capitalizing on our own assets in that respect. So even if we hold our own, as the years progress, this is what it's probably going to look like. I'm guessing that in 2010 we were around 16.7%. I don't know what we were in 2011. And I think this is probably optimistic that by 2050 about 12.9% on average of the percentage of the population will attend church. I'm thinking that that's pretty generous. So we're shrinking and quickly becoming a very significant minority. There's two problems embedded that we face, it seems to me. One is that we have to address the issue of our own retention as congregations. Of the people who can't get connected, who come in the front door and quietly exit 6 months later at the back door. Or the low-hanging fruit that, there are still people, I'm assuming it's true for you too, that without any effort on your part, they just show up on a given Sunday to see what do those Moravians do. That's very, very low-hanging fruit, people. You didn't spend a dime to get them here. You didn't have to do anything. You opened the door. So my question is, what do you do with that? My experience with most churches is that they'll get a handshake and a letter. And I have to tell you this story, because this is true. It happened to me. We moved to Winston-Salem about 7 years ago. We visited several churches. Not yours, so you're off the hook on this one. And it was interesting to see the response. And typically it was just what I said. You walk in, hi, how you doing? Oh, you're a visitor. You don't fill out one of these cards? And then about 2 days later, you get a letter in the mail. One of them was really a disaster. So the line almost says, Chris and Joy Gambill, my wife's name's Joy. Oh, great. And the church's thing opened up. Dear Bob and Mary. Okay. It was an honest mistake, but think about that for just a minute. I think we inadvertently communicate a lot of messages like that. People aren't a part of your congregation and they take the time to show up. You should pay attention. Don't hog-tie them, and you should pay attention. And the more thoughtful you are about that, the more points of contact, the more probability that they're going to actually want to be a part of this congregation and stay here. But you should not count on it happening accidentally or serendipitously. Chances are it won't. And they may never complain. They may just sit quietly and smile for several months until suddenly you say, what happened to Bob and Mary? I don't know. I have 2 children. Feels like more. But this concerns me for several reasons. It ought to concern you. Basically what it says is that by the time a young person is age 29, if they've been engaged in church as a teenager, then 60% of them will not be engaged any longer. Again, for the hearing impaired like me, that's 60%. 60% will not be engaged. So, typically when I go to a congregation, no matter where it is in this country, I find it remarkable if I can find anyone between the ages of 18 and 40. It's remarkable. And there are many, many, many churches today that literally no one's used the nursery in 3 years. There is no children's Sunday school because there are no children. And the only youth belong to the pastor because she and his wife, they brought them. So, again, if we want to have a future, we should pay attention. The difficulty is that we, again, are our own worst enemy. I grew up in church. I suspect some of you did too. That is a great gift, but it's also a great handicap. Because now I don't know how to conceive of life out of that context. So I don't know what it's like for someone not to have had that experience. I almost don't know how to have a conversation with them. My wife, I mentioned, is a librarian, and she's worked at different universities along the way, and typically wherever she goes, people will figure out at some point she's a Christian, she goes to church. And many of them will quietly come to her office and say, "You go to church? Why?" And they're not being critical. They're genuinely curious. A very good-looking, intelligent woman. Help me understand this. This is a mystery to me. They can't conceive of why anyone would waste their time and energy to do that. Before I left it a few years ago at NC State, when I was a campus minister, I was doing an orientation on campus for new students. And I asked a group of about 25 freshmen, I said, how many of you would say you had some sort of a church religious background? 11 of them raised their hands. One of them said, I went to a funeral once. Does that count? So I figured out that the majority of that group, except perhaps for a funeral, had never been inside a church of any kind. They only knew what it looked like because of television. Their families didn't go to church. They didn't go to church. And chances are, they weren't going to. Because they couldn't make the connection between their life and their needs and what the church could offer for them. So we have a gap. And I think a short window of time to try to close it. The graph looks like this. 19% never church, 22% will hang in there, and about 59% will disengage and may or may not ever come back. Part of what's happened is the culture shift. The world I grew up in looked something like this, where family, public education, entertainment, community, Christian education, church was at the center of the world in many ways. And it was supported by the culture to the extent that you couldn't open your store on Sunday. And no one would think about putting anything up against a church event. But now, we're here. Whether we like it or not, whether it's good or bad, really doesn't matter. It is. We are there. We are an option. In the same way that people might view, shall I go to church? Shall I go to Starbucks? Let me think. Better coffee. I'll go to Starbucks. Or I'll play soccer. Or, in my observation coming and going to church, This is the one day of the week I don't work. I want to relax. My wife and I are going to go take the dog for a walk. And I think the stress level of most people is such that they can't imagine on their one day of rest giving half of it to go sit in a building. I'm being honest with you. And that's certainly not how I feel about it, not how I conceive it, but I truly believe that the vast majority of that culture that doesn't have any connection to us views it that way. What will we do about that? Real quickly, just a few things about the region and then about your church. This is a map of North Carolina, church attendance between 1990 and 2000. Now this time there actually are a few pink places that have shown a little bit of growth in church attendance. Among those was Forsyth County. If you go back, and I'm sorry I don't have more recent data than this, but overall, we live in a place with an extraordinarily high percentage of the population still attends church, although it's less than that now because this is 12 years old. But we're far out of the norm for everywhere else in the world, in the country at least. In terms of who goes to church in our area, our region, 31% or some flavor of Baptist, something, 23%, probably non-denominational. Methodist 17%, Lutheran 2%, Reformed 5%, Pentecostal 9%, Christian churches 5%, and Catholic churches 8%. I'm sorry they didn't put you on there. But even this is a shift from what it would have been certainly 30 or 40 years ago. This is a description of the ethnic growth or decline between 1990 and 2000. Non-Hispanic white as a percentage of the population declined 8.5%. And as I look around, that would be us. Non-Hispanic black growth a little bit, 5.6%. Hispanic growth was at 566%. And the startling one that I did not expect was Asian populations grew at 151%. If you get out much, we live in I think, a wonderfully eclectic place. But most every church I go in does not reflect that kind of diversity. Not by any stretch of the imagination. This is a chart that talks about the number of churches. There's been a great emphasis on new church starts. Evangelicals led the way, starting about 100 churches between 1990 and 2000. Mainline churches lost one. Catholics basically had no change. In the end, we end up with 97 that, when this is taken, were still intact. But if we were to keep the same percentage, the same ratio of people who went to church as was present in 1990, we needed to have started 360 churches. So by no stretch of the imagination are we anywhere close to keeping up with the population growth around us. So every day more people are coming, and every day they're not coming to church. Not at mine, not at yours, not at most anybody's. North Carolina is now the 5th, I believe, fastest growing state, with a population increase over the last 10 years of over 18%. Forsyth County in that same period has grown over 14%, and here's the big one that surprised me, Winston-Salem. We've grown almost 24% in the last 10 years. That's a lot of bodies. I've yet to find a church that can anywhere close to approach any of these growth. In fact, we're almost all going in the other direction. There are churches that are growing, and I'll give you a clue about this one. My perception is that in most cases where churches are growing, it is not because they are highly effective in their evangelism of non-Christians. What they're doing is harvesting from all the other churches. And if you don't believe it, poke around. If we had time this morning, I'd love to know, but I bet all of you, or many of you, were something else before you were Moravian. So we're not impacting the larger culture. We're trading shares within, and even that, we're losing money. We're losing people in every transaction. So what about home Moravian? Love feasts are good. In fact, my children asked me this morning, do you get a bun, Dad? No, but I could lobby for it. Love feast attendance is actually pretty steady, both at Christmas and for the Good Friday ones. If I were you and I were seeing this, I would think, either I'd do more love feast, or I'd figure out, what do we do with that? How do we leverage that in a positive, practical way? Because people apparently want to do this. And as good as they are, I don't think they're coming just for buns and coffee. There's something else happening there. However, don't get too excited. The blue line is worship attendance from 2000 to 2010. The purple line is Holy Communion attendance. The red line is Sunday school, and the green one is your Wednesday night. We don't have the capacity to go back, but I think we could figure it out. And before you feel too badly about it, I could put up almost any church in a 10-county area, and it would look better, about the same, or worse. We didn't get stupid or lazy or ignorant, but what we haven't come to grips with is how significantly the culture has changed around us. So the things that we had banked on that worked very well for us as congregations and that helped us to impact the culture and maintain health and strength for a lot of last century, folks, they've gone away. And I hope I can convince you this is not a bump in the road. Something fundamental has happened. And if we don't address it as Christians, and I don't mean just Moravian, we'll be relegated back to a status that looks more like the first century. In fact, we may already be there. Which is not altogether bad news, because they seem to know something we didn't. Giving is a little harder to talk about because we've had such a difficult few years, but overall, for what we've been through, you all have done reasonably well for the last 10 years. This is a little more, I hope, disturbing to you. There's a lot of numbers up there, so let me just play it out for you. This is the giving units in your congregation and the percentage of the budget that they contribute. The big chunk is those from 61 to 70 years, 140 units, and they contribute about 26%. 71 to 80 years old, 98, another 18%. 81 to 90 years, boy, Moravians live a long time, don't they? I need to drink more of that coffee. Another 17%. 91 to 100 years, 18, contributing 3%. 100 years plus, contribute another 1% of your budget. If my addition is about 65% of your budget comes from people who are 61 years and older. It's pretty scourging if you go down. So my question to you would be, how confident are you that people in these categories will be able to equal the giving of people in these categories when they depart this earth? Thank God for every one of these. I did this for my own church. We're in a similar situation. Half of our budget comes from people 71 and older. So you're actually better off. What I'd like to say and remind people is that we're at the point in history where the past does not predict the future. Just because there were people to step up and give at the level they did doesn't mean they will. And we're faced with a generation now, as I send my children off into the world, where their prospects for doing as well or better than their parents are greatly diminished. Not that their parents have done well, but they will struggle. And they are under more economic stress. So this endangers our institutions. What shall we do about that? Your church, I would say, and mine and many others, are in a point where we have a window of opportunity while we still have strength of numbers, strength of financial resources. But that window will close. And so what we do in this time period before then is critical. We have to make some critical decisions and good choices that will allow our institutions to survive and thrive, but moreover, for the cause of Christ, allow us to impact this larger non-Christian culture in the ways that we want to. I wish we had time, maybe another conversation, but there are things that effective growing churches are doing. Here are some of them. If I was going to single out one of these, I would say focus on people and relationships. People really don't come for your great content or your coffee or buns. In the end, what I think most of us really want most and are desperate to have is a real relationship. And we know that that's two, actually, with Christ, but embodied through somebody else. So, I'll conclude with this. Now, perhaps any time more than any time in our lifetime, we have an opportunity for the cause of Christ to make a difference. In a world that's desperate to have our message of hope and transformation, we need to be able to translate that message so that it can be heard. But it will take us doing some things differently. And the way that our church, my church will do them won't be the way that your church, and that doesn't need to be and shouldn't be. But I believe that God has placed us here for a reason, given us purpose and direction in future. And in this interim, I hope that you will diligently seek the Spirit's leadership in determining how you do that. Thank you for letting me be with you. I appreciate your time and your interest. Thank you.